Lately, I've been trying to send you stories every day, but I feel like a large number of people who have signed up almost never come back to listen to the stories. I don't know where that is. Make you unhappy? I hope to receive comments and suggestions from you, and if you find the video good, please give me a like to give me more motivation. For those who have not yet subscribed, don't forget to click the subscribe button and press notification bell to wait for the next story. Now let's get into the story. Story 1. I was a park ranger on a small island, the only year-round resident. Private boat access only with no bridge or ferries. It became crowded in the summer, but we would empty out completely when the weather turned. I loved the off-season, with 400 acres all to myself. No phone, no internet. Sometimes, though, I would get bored. I'd go out at night with a flashlight and challenge myself to hike the entire island in the dark. There was moonlight to navigate by, but there was also a stretch of the main trail that passed through the oldest trees on the island where I'd be plunged into total darkness. I was in the old forest one night when I heard something behind me. I turned, nothing there, turned back, and something brushed my face. My stomach dropped, and I swung my fist into something. I ran full tilt for 100 yards, stomping my boots with my gun belt bouncing up and down, my vest riding up to saw my throat. I stopped and bent over with a stitch in my side and started breathing heavily. I held my hand in front of my eyes and ran my fingers over the prickled cut from the branch I had punched. Through the spread fingers of my injured hand, I saw a smear of bright white off trail ahead. I figured it was one of a small herd of white rump deer the locals wrongfully referred to as palominos, but it moved up a side trail before I could get a better look. I got my breath under control and followed. 100 feet up the side trail, it split again, and I could hear something moving through the underbrush just past the fork and to the right. I crouched as I made my way to the fork and stayed low, trying to keep quiet and unseen. The trail gains elevation as it nears the center of the island, where the trees spread out and the moon lights things up. I heard a sharp bark and froze, then crept forward a few feet. I reached the fork and was straining to see ahead when I heard a crunch and a crack of something in the brush behind me. I spun and saw a pale man about 6 feet tall with dark hair wearing a bright white t-shirt about 30 feet away from me. He gave me a grin that can only be described as psychotic. He barked again and then ran off into the woods. I stood still scanning the trees, my hand on my gun. After not hearing anything for a few moments, I backtracked my way to the main trail, then, terrified, speed walked all the way back to my cabin. I hiked the exterior again that night, with a flashlight this time, and checked the coast for evidence of any visitor, boater, or wayward traveler. Nothing. I got up early morning, and in the light of the day, I did the same with the same result. I don't know who it could have been. The way he was running around off-trail convinced me that he knew the island very well, better than me, and that he was hiding out somewhere, but I never found him. I never found any evidence of a secret lair, and I never saw him again. Story 2. We hiked about 5 miles into a small lake and set up camp on a small beach. This was not a heavily trafficked area, and we did not expect to run into anyone. Our first night there, as we were sitting around the fire, we saw a flashlight moving on the other side of the lake around 1030. This was fairly unusual. However, we did not think too much of it. But as time went on, this flashlight kept moving around the lake, getting closer to our campsite. Once it was clear that the person or people were heading for our campsite, we moved off into the woods nearby to see who wandered up. Now, the moment of truth. The flashlight comes near the light of our fire, and it is one man. He has a beard and is probably in his mid-40s. The scary part, he was carrying what looked to be a shotgun. He walked around the campsite a few times, and then proceeded to enter our tent. After rummaging around for a minute or so, he came out and started yelling, "I know you're out there. Why don't you come and say hello?" My friend and I remained motionless under a hemlock tree, about 50 yards away. That is when the man proceeded to fire his shotgun into the woods. He also swung his flashlight around several times. After what felt like hours, he grabbed my friend's backpack and a few articles of clothing we had drying off near the fire, and threw them in to burn. Thankfully, the man moved off after a little while. We waited until his flashlight was on the other side of the lake. When it disappeared, we grabbed everything we could fit in my pack and took off. It was about 2 or 3 in the morning. We immediately went to the police department and reported it, where we also spoke with some forest rangers. That was it. I haven't heard anything back from the police yet. Who knows what the man would have done if we hadn't run into the woods to hide. Story 3. I was camping, and I had brought a Kodak disposable camera with me on the trip. I wanted to get my pictures developed as soon as I could, because I was eager to show my friends and family the wildlife and gorgeous views I had seen on my camping trip. After a couple of days, I got a call from Costco, where my pictures were being developed, that I could come and pick them up. I didn't have the patience to wait to see all the pictures, so I opened the package up as soon as I got into my car. They had come out amazing. And then I got to the last set of pictures. There were 10 pictures I did not remember taking. There's no way I could have took them. The pictures were of me, sleeping in my tent. Somebody was in my tent. Story 4. A few years ago, I was backpacking in eastern Washington with some friends of mine. I don't know how well you guys know eastern Washington, but it is pretty much dust, sagebrush, and dirt. We decided to hike up onto the top of this canyon. And from up there, you could see the miles and miles of straight nothing. After a few hours of traversing the top of the cliff, we eventually found a little crevice that kind of took us a little ways underground, into a pretty decent-sized cave. The cave was filled with little bones, like mice and bats. In one of the corners of the cave, there was a rock fixture that jutted up from the ground and almost made a separate room, so to speak. In the room, we found lots of scratches on the walls, photographs, and 3 bottles with notes in them. While this was kind of off-putting on its own, we figured it was just some sort of joke and we'd find some silly SOS notes in the bottles or something. The scariest part about it all was the photographs were super ordinary, of families and normal-looking people, and 2 of the notes in the bottles made no sense at all. While it was in English, it was pretty much straight gibberish. None of the words made sense in context with the other words. The 3rd bottle had a super ordinary letter talking about what they'd been up to, something you would send to a fairly distant relative after not talking with them for a while. I don't really know what to think of it all. I feel like it could easily have been someone just joking around, but it was almost too strange for that. Story 5. It was just me and my buddy backpacking. After hiking all day, we found a good spot next to the creek to set up the tent before it got dark. We got everything set up, made a fire, cooked some food, then sat around and talked before going to sleep. My point here is that we had spent a good amount of time in the area and should have seen anything weird laying around. I was first to wake up and leave the tent in the morning. We set it up with the door facing the creek. The first thing I saw when I unzipped the door was a blue, dirty stuffed bear. It looked like an old Care Bear, sitting on a rock next to the creek. It was positioned sitting up and facing our tent. Obviously, at that point, I was freaking out. I woke my buddy up, who was equally as freaked out when he saw it. No way my friend did it either, since I was last asleep and the first awake, and he was just as creeped out as I was. We never heard anything weird that night. No one bothered us, and none of our stuff was messed with. We cut the trip 2 days short and headed back to the car. Another reason I'm sure he didn't do it. Best explanation I have is that some creeper was watching us from back in the tree line and we had absolutely no clue, which is a pretty sobering thought. Story 6. I worked in a psych ward years ago. There was a 7-year-old kid that was sent there once because his mom didn't know what to do with him. It was a sadly common thing to happen, even if the kids don't have psych issues. The mom was shaking and crying and they had to take the kid into another room. She was genuinely afraid of her own son. She had suspected something was wrong when she kept finding mutilated animals in the backyard, but never heard or saw coyotes or anything around that could have done it. The neighbor's smaller pets started to disappear. The boy had an obsession with knives, hiding them around the house, denying anything when the mom confronted him. Then when the two started getting into arguments, he would get really violent and hit her, push her down and kick her, threaten to kill her. On multiple occasions, she woke up in the middle of the night with him standing beside her bed, staring her in the face. She put extra locks on her bedroom door to feel safe while she slept. The last straw was when she lifted up his mattress and found knives everywhere. That's when she brought him to us. I remember talking to him, treating him like he was just any other kid that came through. He seemed remarkably normal, until you spoke directly to him. He had this way of looking right through you, or maybe like he didn't see you at all while you were speaking. He would respond like a robot, like he was just saying words because that's what we wanted to hear, and he always put on this creepy dead-looking smile, like all mouth and no eye involvement in the smile at all, especially when he would get away with something, like taking another kid's markers and they couldn't figure it out. It still gives me the chills laying here thinking about him. I'm actually had to just get up and close my bedroom door. That year, I believe I met a 7-year-old psychopath. Story 7. A good friend of mine was backpacking about 10 years ago when he found a cell phone deep in the woods that was still powered on with half a battery. There was nothing else around it or anyone nearby that it could have belonged to. He found it just far enough off of a trail that it very likely could have been thrown there. The last number dialed was 911. He turned the cell phone into police, but nothing ever came of it. Story 8. Nothing I can say can possibly describe the year I worked in psychiatric intensive care. There was a woman that came in and sat down across the table from me with her admission interview. She had bandages all over her arms and scotch tape over her mouth and ears. She looked very uncomfortable and wouldn't really sit still. When the nurse would ask her a question, she would peel the corner of the tape back and answer, and then stick the tape back on really fast. We eventually found out that she saw and felt bugs crawling all over her all the time. They were trying to get inside her body, according to her. The tape was to keep the bugs out. The bandages were because some bugs got in and she had to dig them out. She couldn't sit still because she felt the bugs all over her, even while we sat and talked. The worst part was, she had some idea that it was her mind playing tricks on her. Can you imagine going through your life feeling like someone is continuously dumping buckets of cockroaches on your head? Feeling like they're all over you and getting inside of you to the point that you're digging chunks out of your own flesh in a panic. All while knowing intellectually that none of it is real. Story 9. I'm a train conductor. One time in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, it was 10 degrees and a foot of snow on the ground. My train went into emergency. I had to walk the length of the train to see what the problem was. The train was right in the middle of a very small town. As I'm walking by one of the houses on the outskirts of this town, I see a guy standing in a driveway about 50 feet away from me, wearing a trench coat. The first thing that struck me as odd is that it was way too cold to be wearing just a trench coat. I shine my lantern on the guy and wave. Nothing. The guy doesn't even move. I continue walking past the guy to the end of the train while looking back very often. I get to the end, turn around, and head back. I get back to the house where this guy is standing, and he is still there, in the same place, in the same position. I don't say anything this time. I just speed walk back to the head of the train. The next day I'm taking the train back home during the day. I'm paying special attention to this house as we go by it. There is nothing there. The driveway isn't shoveled. Nothing is there that could have been mistaken for a guy in a trench coat. I have since been by this house dozens of times, and I have never seen a car parked there, or a light on, or anything at all. Story 10. This is not my story, but a good friend of mine. He was the youngest recruit to pass police training in his area for a long time. At 19 years old, he was fresh onto the service. I went for a pint with him a week later, and you could tell he had seen things, so I asked him what was it like. He told me about one incident where they were called to a domestic dispute. They got to the house and opened the door. Instantly, a whole load of sewer rats, not pet rats, flooded out of the house, and there was no one home. The lights were on, the TV was on, and the loud voices they heard arguing were gone. The only life there was the rats that ran out of the house. They searched the house, every nook and cranny, and found no one. He and his partner for the evening stayed around a while, and waited to see if anyone came home, but after a few hours, no one came. The neighbors couldn't even explain it, so they left. A few minutes later, they got called to the same address again by a different person stating there's a pretty heated domestic dispute going on. This time, they brought the dog squad to find people, but again, the house was deserted. He said the scariest thing was that the toilet had blatantly just been flushed when they got there, as the tank was filling, and the kettle was now boiling. The dogs found nothing as well. To this day, he has no explanation for that incident. Story 11. This story takes place in August of 2013 in the mountains of southern Oregon. I am a USAF Security Forces airman, which is a military policeman. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick, another military cop, and I decided to go explore some back roads and get out of the heat in town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used, and many totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I spent many of our days off starting on roads that we knew, finding roads we didn't know, driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over the mountains, we set off on a road we had never been on before, and began the drive into the mountains. After driving for about an hour, We hadn't seen nor heard any signs of other people in the woods. We rounded a bend in the thick fir woods and emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noise, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. It was painted bright orange and was much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as aspens grow extremely close together. When we parked by the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to go check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'. Regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to even sit on them. As I was looking at the table, Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of color that was completely out of place in the thick trees. A small, one-man tent was set back in the trees, about 50 feet from the strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread, and felt certain that there was someone in the tent, and if we could see the tent, they could see us. There were no campgrounds in this area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely someone camping so remotely would be, at the very least, a strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we didn't see any movement or hear any sounds coming from it. Nick suggested my call out. I didn't want to, but I did. Hey, anyone in there? No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving this strange area, but we began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in the tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it all the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. Should we need to leave in a hurry, he would be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees toward the tent. I was totally keyed up with my senses on full alert. When I reached the campsite, several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over the place. No fire had been built, no wood collected. The tent was literally full of backpacks and women's clothing. Full of dread, I turned to leave and tell Nick what I had seen. As I left, I heard Nick start yelling, "Let's go. Let's get out of here." Not knowing why he was yelling, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt into the passenger seat and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men. A third person was laying against the window in the back. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and accelerated the way he had come from. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified that they would catch up, we hit the highway without seeing the car again. I still do not know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police and they promised to send a trooper out to check out the scene. However, I received a call the next day from a trooper stating that the campsite, the backpacks, and the women's clothing were not there. The strange table was still by the thick aspen grove. I have not returned to this area and do not intend to. Story 12. Dispatch gets a call from an older couple reporting there's a man standing in their backyard. It's later in the evening and obviously the older couple is freaked out a bit. Several officers show up including my friend and split into two groups heading around either side of the house. As they emerge in the backyard, guns drawn, they see the suspect and promptly order him to get on the ground, face first, hands behind his head. As they draw closer, he's not responding and they realize he hasn't moved at all. Rewind 2 hours. The suspect had robbed a 7-Eleven or something like that down the road and taken off on foot. As he entered the neighborhood, he tried to cut through this older couple's backyard. When he went to hop the fence in the back, he slipped and impaled himself on a fence post. He couldn't pull himself off and it was his own body weight slowly that drove him down onto the post. It had entered at his groin and went straight up to his shoulder. He was literally a human scarecrow. Story 13. I am a police officer, and this one time I went out on a call of a suspicious person at a house near where I was at. When I get there, the guy tells me that someone knocked on his door, and when he went to see who it was, there was a woman standing in his driveway with some sort of child-sized doll with horns, and it looked like all bloody and cut up. So he asked the woman who was looking away from him what she wanted. She turned around and told him, and then started screaming at the top of her lungs and ran at him. So like a normal human being, he slammed the door in her face and called the cops. I get there and there are well-defined claw marks on his door. There is also a good bit of blood, I suppose from her fingers. So I call it out and start the search on foot. I also had 2 or 3 units driving around the area to see if they can't find this woman. So I'm about a block away, and we get another call that the woman is back at the guy's house, but in the backyard. So I run about a block back to the guy's house and bust into his backyard. The lights are out, so I have my flashlight out and I'm looking around. I see the woman huddled in the corner next to the evil-looking doll thing and I ask her if she's okay. She doesn't say anything. About this time, one of my mobile units came back to the house and parked his car where the headlights were shining on her so we could see how scary this woman looked. She had long black hair, her clothes were rags, she had no shoes, clearly homeless, and she kept whispering things to the doll. So my buddy and I approached and tried talking to her and she just kept whispering to the doll. Couldn't understand what the hell she was saying, so we decided to drag her out of there. The second we put hands on this woman, she went berserk. Punching, kicking, slapping. So we're fighting with her trying to get her on the ground and she's not going down. This woman was incredibly strong. In the fight, she somehow got away from us and was sitting in a crouched position with her head tilted to the side making the creepiest growl, snarling sound I've ever heard. Then she screams at the top of her lungs and charges at us. So my buddy straight jabbed her in the face and knocked her clean out. We handcuffed her and hauled her off to the hospital where she tested positive for PCP. She was charged with battery of a peace officer, resisting arrest, and trespassing. Later she was institutionalized for some sort of mental disorder. Not sure quite what it was. My department didn't have anything more to do with her after that. And we never saw her again. Story 14. In college, I spent 1 month house sitting a large hunting estate in the middle of nowhere, Idaho, where the nearest town was 22 miles away. It was June 1987. I know it was 87 because it was the baseball season after the Bill Buckner disaster. My girlfriend's parents owned the place in Idaho. I'm not going to say what town it was 22 miles away from, because they might still own it, and I don't want this to get any more weird than it already is. It was a pretty big place with a lot of acreage. The guy who was the full-time caretaker for the place had just quit. My girlfriend's dad went out there to find a new caretaker, but the new caretaker couldn't start for a month. Her dad offered to pay me $1,200 to go out there. Free food, satellite TV, one of those huge satellite dishes from back then, and free booze. All I had to do was keep an eye on the place and feed the dogs and the horse. I had never been out west, so I took him up on it. It sounded better than doing landscaping. I spent the time reading and exploring, playing with the dogs, riding the horse, and shooting. Completely uneventful experience. Until one night, I woke up to the sound of someone knocking loud and hard on the front door, and the dogs were going nuts. No way I was going to answer it. I just grabbed the gun and kept quiet upstairs. After the knocking stopped and dogs stopped barking, I eventually went back to sleep. I didn't freak out all that much, because there were 2 German shepherds inside with me, and I had a gun. I kept it on the nightstand. I had been drinking a little, but was not drunk by any means. There were several neighbors a few miles away, so I thought someone just simply drove up the wrong driveway. The next morning at the crack of dawn, I opened the front door to let the dogs out, and I see a white Chevy Nova sitting in the driveway near the small cabin for the caretaker. The cabin was about 100 yards from the main house. I called my girlfriend's dad and asked him if he knew anyone with that car, and told him about what had happened the night before. He didn't know anyone, and he called the police directly. The police show up, ask me a few questions, and walk around the property for about an hour or so. The car was locked. The police had it towed. I have no idea if it was broken down or not. There was only one set of tire tracks coming into the house. A few days later, my girlfriend's dad called me up to say the guy who owned that car was missing, and to call the police if anything weird happened again. I have no idea who the guy was at all. I don't know how long he was missing, or when he was reported missing, or who reported him missing. My girlfriend's dad didn't know that much. After 1 month, I go back home. The girlfriend and I break up shortly thereafter. I see her out on the town several months later, and I ask her if she ever found out what happened to that guy. All she knows is that the guy was found dead about 30 miles away. I asked her how he died, and she said she had no idea. I never saw her again after that, and I still think about this all the time. I have no idea if it was him knocking on the house that night, or someone else. Not knowing will drive me crazy for the rest of my life. Story 15. So this happened 3 years ago when I was living with my parents in Wyoming, in a secluded area. It was Halloween, and my parents decorated the house, and we expected about 3 to 4 kids to show up, as the house is about a mile from a subdivision, and parents usually drive their kids. At 8:00 p.m., I took in the chair with candy, because I figured no one else would be coming around. I was in the basement where there were no windows, and very little sound could get out. It was about 11 p.m. now. All the lights upstairs were shut off as I went to bed. I heard a knock at the side door, which no one ever goes to outside. I headed upstairs, and the floodlight, which usually turns on automatically, wasn't on at all. So I flipped on the other light that lights up the basketball hoop area. There was a person, in one of those old man masks, that had the crazy hair, just standing there, just looking at the house. He sprinted to the back where the patio was, and I heard a loud banging on the back windows. Honestly, the loudest kicking I've ever heard. I rushed over and the person was just staring through the glass. Then he ran away and I didn't hear anything for about 5 minutes or so. Then I start hearing the knob to the main front door being forcefully jiggled back and forth. I ran upstairs to the bedroom and went to the crawl space in the attic, immediately dialing 911. This was the first time I had ever dialed 911, so I didn't know what I was expecting. But the operator didn't seem to be very shocked or wanting to send out a car very quickly. I repeated my address like 12 times, and the lady kept saying, "Calm down, sir." She wanted me to stay on the line, but I was afraid if the guy got in, he would know where I was because of my voice. I hung up, and I could hear the knob being slammed, like he had a hammer or something. I have a full-on panic attack, and I was wheezing, trying to get air. Then I heard the side door, the original door, being kicked super hard. At this point, I shook so badly, the dust from the floorboards flew up in the air. I heard a window smash, and I immediately knew he was going to get in. I held my breath, which makes the wheezing worse. I was listening to hear footsteps or anything. Nothing. The actual amount of time I spent up there was around 16 minutes, though I swear it felt like hours. An officer showed up and pounded on the door. I ran downstairs and flipped open the door. I told him everything as well as the backup sheriffs that got there. They all kept saying a friend was probably just trying to scare me. I had no friends in Wyoming. None. They looked around the house and wrote down some notes, but nothing really happened. They left, and I drove behind them to Cody, Wyoming, and got a hotel room. I still can't sleep without all the lights on, and a 45 on my dresser. Story 16. A few years ago, a group of friends and I learned about an abandoned local cemetery. We go during the day to check it out. There are about 30 or so gravestones, ranging from 80 years old all the way down to a 5-year-old girl. The newest grave is at least 70 years old. Living in a young town, I realize many suburbs bear the names of these same gravestones. We decide to return later on at night and play hide and seek. When we arrive after dark, my perception of the area totally changes. What was scenic and sort of sad earlier now feels scary. All the graves are partially hidden by long grass, and large dead trees surround the area. We pick someone to be it, and proceed to hide. I don't hide particularly well, but I remain unfound for some time. So I lie near a fence in the long grass, playing on my phone. After about 10 minutes, I hear some grass around me move. This is Australia, so there's a chance it is, and who am I kidding, it definitely is, something that could kill me. So I move into a more defendable position, yet stay hidden. This new position puts my back to a gravestone. Another few minutes pass, as the wind picks up, and the temperature drops by a few degrees. I swear, I feel someone touch my shoulder. The voice of a little girl whispers next to me, "You're it." Needless to say, I freak and scream, which also freaks out my friends. After a brief explanation of what happened, we quickly relocate to the entrance of the area to make sure everyone got out. The gate is downhill of the graves, so looking up, they are silhouetted. When we confirm everyone is there, one of the other guys grabs my arm and points up the hill. And I kid you not, we see a little girl standing by a tree, staring at us. fastest I have ever run in my life. Story 17. My best friend and I were at her house, chilling in the computer room. We heard a huge thump come from her room above us, like a heavy thud. We looked at each other, confused. All of her siblings were downstairs with us. We decided, screw it, let's check it out. We grabbed some airsoft guns, a bat, and she picked up a bag of bagels. We get upstairs. Her bedroom door was open, which was no big deal until we saw her oak dresser move about a foot. She yelped and pointed at something. So I looked. There was a girl under her bed. Not her sister. Just some girl. She threw the bag of bagels at her, and we booked our asses downstairs. We came back with my friend's parents, and the mysterious girl was gone. To this day, we have no idea who it was, or why she was there. Story 18. 15 years ago I went camping with 2 school friends in bushland that backed onto my dad's property in Australia. My dad didn't spend much time at the house, but said we could use it as a base to dump any gear we might not need. He also gave me a heads up that he might creep up to our campsite that night and scare the guys I was with. We hiked from the house for about 5 hours through very dense brush, where we found a clearing, and decided to set up camp. Looking around the place for firewood, we kept turning up a lot of old bones. Some so old, they almost looked like wood. We concluded that due to the land once being used for farming, it was likely they were cow bones. We came up with a few more theories for the sake of scaring each other, and then built our fire. Even burning a couple of the wood-like bones just to see what would happen, and settled in. I was woken up by one of my buddies at about 1 a.m., who said he swears he saw torchlight on the tent wall. Great, I thought. We sat in silence for a few minutes before the light came back. This was great. I really hammed it up, making up stories about murders in the area, and escaped prisoners. The light from the torch fixed on our tent, and then switched off. We could hear leaves and sticks moving around outside, and my buddies were on the verge of tears. Then we started hearing whispering outside, as well as some low mumbling. Dad had brought some friends in on the prank. Dedicated. The torchlight came back on, and pressed right up to the tent wall, and a hand began tapping across the top, while the whispering continued. My dad had brought some friends in on the prank, and convinced them to walk 4 hours through dense scrub in the middle of the night, just to shine a torch on our tent. I started to panic. Then it just stopped completely, about an hour after it began. We sat in total silence aside from the sobbing of my buddies, and at dawn, packed up and left. We got back to the house and Dad was there. He apologized, and said he had planned to come out and see us last night, but fell asleep at his girlfriend's house. We told him about what happened, and he was genuinely dumbfounded. Interestingly, I went back to the spot a couple of years ago, after telling this story to a friend. We found a small shack made of iron, pockmarked with bullet holes, a 44-gallon drum full of burned clothes, a pile of firewood, and 2 axes. Who knows if it was related, but it was creepy as hell. Story 19. This happened over a decade ago, somewhere in northern Michigan during the summer. My friend Kathy, who is 18, my boyfriend's half-sister, May, of 16, and me, of 17, drove down from our hometown to visit friends, and were on our way back home in Kathy's shitty little Geo. By shitty, I'm talking this piece of crap had engine problems, overheating problems, ignition problems, and was constantly falling apart. More than once. It had stalled or just stopped working in the middle of the street while we were trying to get somewhere. But Kathy thought we'd be fine since we hadn't had any problems with it to our friend's house. It was a little past midnight, and we were roughly an hour away from home, and there's nobody on the road, with dense wood on every side, no streetlights, no moon, and I can barely see past the windshield because I have a form of albinism, which leaves me legally blind in my left eye and with really awful vision of my right eye. My depth perception is terrible, and I can't see more than a few feet ahead of me at most, but usually, I can make out lights and other cars when they pass and sometimes street signs and people when they are close enough. We drove down this narrow, hilly road, and on the descent down a hill, the geo makes a strange sound. Kathy starts braking, and when we get to the bottom of the hill, the car doesn't work anymore. Kathy swears and turns on the hazard lights. She and I get out of the vehicle and help pop the hood, which causes a bunch of smoke to fly out. After the smoke mostly clears, Kathy tries to figure out what went wrong this time. We stand in the dark for at least 45 minutes before we realize that she couldn't fix the car and that we needed a tow truck. These were the days of MapQuest printouts and brick phones, so we couldn't whip out our smartphones and look up the closest tow truck. I decided to give a call to my boyfriend Caleb in order for him to pick us up and suggest we come with a tow to pick up Geo when it was daylight. Me and Kathy agree, so I take out my cruddy Nokia and call my boyfriend. Only to come to the delightful realization that we have no service. I ask me and Kathy if by some kind of miracle either of them have service. Since they both check and shake their heads, me gets a bit panicky and we hold up our phones trying to get a signal to no avail. It's extremely hot and after failing to get any kind of service we are all feeling a bit spooked and uncomfortable. Me begs us to do something because she is far more afraid than Kathy and I. Kathy attempts to calm me down and I wonder if the thick woods and hills are blocking our reception. I tell me and Kathy to wait by the car and walk away from them up the hill we had just come down, holding my phone up. We still have no signal. I walk further and further away until I reach the top of the hill. I can't see the outline of the geo anymore, but I can still hear me at a distance. Even at the top of the hill I don't get a signal. I know it's got to be the trees in the way, so I get this idea of climbing up a tree and calling from there just to see if it works. In hindsight, this was not my brightest idea, but me being an idiot, I saunter off into the woods in search of a climbable tree. At this point I just want to go home, and this is the only thing on my mind. I find a nice one with low branches and lift my body upwards towards the trunk. I climb the branches higher and higher, and about midway up the tree I feel my pack of cigarettes fall out of my short pocket. I'm kind of annoyed but figure that I can just look for them when I climb back down. I take my phone and hold it up when I get near the top and I have service. Relieved, I call Khaled and he doesn't pick up, so I call again and again and again until he does. He answers in a sleepy but pissed voice, but I'm having none of that and simply explain our situation. He asks where we are and I give him the name of the road and my best guess as to how far along we are on it. He says he will be on his way and tells me to go back and wait with May and Kathy, then yells at me for being stupid and climbing a tree in the dark with my bad depth perception. I assure him that I'm fine. He's skeptical but says okay, and we hang up. I start climbing down the tree and my hand touches a big glob of sap, so I stop and try to wipe this sticky goop on my shirt. I'm already sweaty and gross, so I'm not too happy about the sap. While I'm failing at getting this crud off my hands, I hear the strangest sound from somewhere below me. I completely freeze, not being able to place what the hell that sound was, but it's moving pretty fast. I stare down into the darkness below me but can't see shit. I just hear this noise continuing. It comes closer and closer, and then I hear it right below my tree, and then it stops under my tree. I hold on to the branches as tight as I can and wait. I hear leaves shuffling and twigs snapping, and after a while that stops, and the weird noise starts again, but heading away from me deeper into the woods. I wait until I can no longer hear the sound, and then finish climbing down and jump out of the tree. It's completely silent now besides the sounds of the woods, so I grope up on the ground for my cigarettes. I don't find them, so I make my way out to the woods and back towards the road. I jog down the hill, and when I reach the bottom I notice that Kathy and May are not standing outside the car anymore, and the hazard lights are off. I walk over to the car, and May rolls down the window a little bit and whispers in a panicked voice, "Elizabeth." I point back over my shoulder towards the hill and started to explain that I called her brother, but Kathy yelled, "What are you doing? Get the hell back in the car." I give them a weird look, but May unlocks and opens the door, and I crawl into the back seat with her slamming the door behind me. Kathy slams the locks and double checks them while May rolls up the window and makes sure the rest are rolled up. One of the windows has never closed all the way, but there's less than a finger space, so it's not too much of a big deal, but May is freaked out about it, and Kathy has lost her cool as well. I'm still confused and ask exactly what the hell is going on. May tells me that a bit after I went up the hill, some weird person came out of the woods and ran really fast up the hill in the direction that I went. They got freaked out and turned the lights off and got into the car. They thought he got me, and I'm honestly scared at this point, because if I hadn't have stopped to wipe the sap off my hands, I most likely would have gotten out of the tree at the time that I heard the weird noise. I just knew it was that person. I tell them my story, and everybody in the car was scared shitless but are relieved that Khaled is on his way. We only have to play the waiting game now. We sit on the road for what seems like forever. The dread we were feeling made time seem like it was going slower than normal. Kathy and May are looking out the windows surveying the area, and I'm just sitting there hoping Khaled will hurry the hell up and come rescue us. Suddenly I hear May whine, "Oh my God," and she starts crying. Kathy snaps her head to where May is looking and stifles a gasp. I look where they're facing but see nothing but the dark. Then I hear it through the small opening in the window. May ducks down as though doing that will make her invisible, and Kathy hides her head behind the steering wheel. I follow their lead and sort of hunch down in my seat, but the noise comes straight up to the window. I can almost make out the silhouette of a tall, skinny man, and then he presses his face against May's window, and I can finally see him. Nobody screams. You'd think we would, but it didn't happen. We all just stared at each other. He looks at us for a while until Kathy switches on her brights in the hope that it would scare him off, but it did nothing. The dude just walked to the front of the car and stood in front of the headlights. Maybe he thought he could block us from leaving. I don't know. I couldn't make out his features very well, but the guy had to have been somewhere a bit over 6 foot and no older than 30. He had the face of your average Joe. Nothing special. Nothing really sinister or particularly creepy that you'd notice about him if you ran into this dude in broad daylight. Dark shaved hair, pale skin, long face. May said he had light-colored eyes and stubble with eyebrows that made him look like he was always concerned, but there was no way I could make that out, so I had to take her word for it. What was really weird was that it was like 80 degrees, and this dude was wearing corduroys, which is what the sound was. Corduroys make that swishy noise when you walk, and an oversized sweater with abnormally long sleeves. The sleeves went over his hand and flopped back and forth as he paced around in front of the Geo. I'm not sure how long he was in front of the car for, but it was a while. Then good old Corduroy starts doing something really bizarre. He bends his arms up towards his face, which I can only describe as attempting to look like a praying mantis because of the way his sleeves were hanging, and then he begins walking circles around the car, rhythmically taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back like goddamn Willy Wonka but on speed. This is when I noticed the swishing sound matched up exactly to the sound I heard when I was back in the trees. He was doing the 2 steps forward, 1 step back in the woods when he was going after me, as though this wasn't weird enough. By now May was sobbing and Kathy seemed like she had to vomit, so I felt like I had to be the brave one. I looked at the slight space in the open window, and when he orbited his way over here I said, "Hey man, can you just stop? You're really freaking us out." Corduroy definitely heard me, so he came to a halt and looked back into the car through the windshield straight at me. I asked him very firmly to leave, and he took an extended pause, smiled, then Willy Wonkaed his way out of my line of vision and into the darkness. After a while, Kathy said he disappeared into the woods, and May was like, "I can't believe that worked." We awkwardly laughed about the weirdo and glad he left and whatever, and went back to waiting for Kayla, somewhat reassured but still paranoid. But after some time Kathy said, "Oh no, he's back." I couldn't see, but apparently he was doing the 2 steps forward, 1 step back parallel to us on the side of the road, and this time he had a big tree branch he was holding with his sweater-covered hands. May got scared again, and I held her hand so she would feel better about it, even though I was ready to shit myself. It was awful because I didn't know if he was coming towards us or if he was moving away or what the hell he was up to. It was kind of like when you knew you were going to be in a jump scare in a horror movie. Then I heard Corduroy swish back towards the geo and onto my window. He smacks it with the tree branch. May and I panic, and I scooped as close to her as possible. They see the dude back up into the woods, then come running back and slamming the branch back into the window like he's jousting with no horse. Thankfully the window didn't break, but it got terrifying hearing the noise as he did this repetitively. Kathy perks up in her seat and starts pointing at the road ahead. I see headlights. She blares the horn and flashes the lights. Lo and behold, it's our savior Khaled. He bought his older brother Alex, and they both get out of his car and head over to us. May's sobs turn into joyous laughter as her brothers approach. Now Khaled and Alex have always been tall guys. Walking around with them was like walking around with high elves. I felt very safe. Khaled was a towering 6'8" and Alex around 6'5", so I thought 2 dudes taller than the Corduroy jester would make him leave. But nope. Khaled walks towards Corduroy trying to assess the situation, and Alex comes over to the car and taps on the window and tells Kathy to get out. She does, and he walks over to her car, and then he comes back and puts the car in neutral so that he can push it off to the side of the road. May and I slowly get out of the car, and May bolts for her brother's car. I help Alex push the car to the side while Khaled distracts the jouster by holding the end of his stick and telling him to piss off. Corduroy yanks the branch away from Khaled and starts backing up by going 2 steps backwards, 1 step forwards, and then disappears into the darkness down the street. I can't see him, but Khaled can. The dude backs up pretty far and then comes launching at Khaled, who sprints the other way down the road because that stick could have really hurt him. He bumps past Alex, who's already got out of the Geo, and it was opening his car door, leaving me behind the Geo alone. Corduroy apparently changed directions and aimed the stick at me, but I really couldn't tell. I just hear everyone shout Elizabeth. And this startles me. I jump to the side of the Geo, hearing Corduroy smash his stick into the back window with a loud thud. I take the long way around the car and sprint off into the road and feel Khaled grab my arm and tug me over Alex's car. I feel like the wind had been knocked out of me and my legs didn't seem to work, but Caleb manages to shove me into the back seat and scrambles into the passenger side. By now we are all safely in the car and Corduroy is standing like a mantis in front of the headlights again. He abandoned his stick and stood there with no intentions to move. Alex puts the car into reverse, slams on the gas, making me knock my head against the door, then makes the sloppiest U-turn ever and nearly drives us into the woods but gets us back onto the road. Everyone was 100% freaked out to the max as Alex tore away far over whatever the speed limit was. Me and Kathy swear they saw the Corduroy guy chasing us after Alex made the U-turn, but there was no way he could catch up with us. The next day I went back there with Caleb, Kathy and the dude from the tow truck place. There was no sign of Corduroy anymore, but when we approached the Geo we saw that the space where the window didn't close all the way were my cigarettes. The box was missing, but they were all neatly jammed in a row along the window space. I have no doubt it was the work of the Corduroy jouster. To this day I wonder if he knew I was up the tree and took my cigarettes, or if he thought I dropped them and went further into the woods to look for me, or if he just found them later and decided to stick them through the window because he was absolutely batshit insane. I've also still wonder what the hell his intentions were. I still have so many questions. Kathy got a new car that summer after she told her dad what happened. May wanted to go to the police but didn't even know what we would tell them. Some weirdo was smacking a stick on our car at night and put cigarettes into the window menacingly. The cops probably wouldn't believe a bunch of young people. They'd most likely assume we were on drugs. I was recently talking to Alex and May about the incident, and Alex urged me to share this. I hope none of you are from northern Michigan, and if you're in the area, be careful along the roads. You never know what could be around you in the trees. Story 20. My freshman year of college was one of the funnest years of my life, and some of my fondest memories are from that year, but it was also the scariest and strangest year to date. I'm 31 now, and this is thanks to one story in particular that takes place over the entire school year. I still sometimes wonder how this really happened, and I didn't end up a shut-in nut job, and it still freaks me out to this day. I've only started talking about it once or twice since it happened 13 years ago. August 2001, like most freshmen, I lived in the dorms at a state party school. I opted out of the good school I got into. I guess I had a little steam to blow off after graduating from a military college/prep boarding school. Plus, after a sports injury, I didn't exactly have any specific plan for life that went past Saturday night, if you know what I mean. A good buddy from military school, Bill, went to the same college and lived a few floors below the same dorm as me. So of course we were getting the party started before my parents' exhausted fumes had even evaporated from the parking lot. For the most part, the first month or so of college was pretty much like that. Normal. I went to most of my classes, partied just about every night, chased girls around, and that was enough for the moment. But things began to change one night sometime in mid-September, and college, for me, would never be normal again. My dorm phone rings in the middle of the night. It's a landline, so I answer. Hello. On the other end, I can only really describe the voice as the kind of picture when you think about a computer talking. Kind of like the early car models of GPS. Hi, Gary. How are you today? Not fully awake. I just was confused at this point. Who is this? He repeats. Hi, Gary. How are you today? It became clear. I'm being screwed with. So I hang up and chuckle. Screw Bill. Nice one. And I pass back out. I ended up forgetting about the call for a few days and never mentioned it to Bill or anyone else. About a week later, I get another call around the same time of night. "Hi, Gary. I'm watching you." Nice. Very click. "Seriously, Bill. How are you not knee-deep in Everclear or a Tridel at this hour? Enough already." Kate, my roommate, was starting to get pissed, and I hang up. I usually confront my oh-so-clever amigo at breakfast the next morning. I casually confront my oh-so-clever amigo at breakfast the next morning, purposely not trying to bite too hard to give him a payoff that might incentivize continued calls. I also was 100% sure it was actually him and not after another one of my douchebag friends. He gives me a genuinely confused response. Whatever. So a couple of days later, after the second call, I come home and see some messages on the answering machine. Whoa, I barely knew that thing worked. It was the computer voice guy. As my machine cuts off for the first 1 or 2 seconds of the message, it tells me it's a bot set to play messages upon answering. "Hi Gary, I'm watching you." The second message goes, "I thought I asked you to answer my calls, Gary." The third message, "Where might Gary be on a Tuesday night?" Okay. So one of my friends is clearly being an arsehole or bored enough to really push for a reaction here. The next day, I play the message for Kate, who was around during the calls, which were apparently earlier in the night when he was still awake. He'd been a close buddy of mine since we were in junior high, but we'd sort of taken separate paths after high school. So anyway, he's aware that I'm a wild child and thinks nothing of the first couple of messages. But by the third, he's a little spooked. I then walk down to a couple of other buddies' rooms and casually, but immediately, bring up the subject. Nada. Over the next couple of days, I press my close and semi-close friends, but get 0 answers and 0 suspects. The calls start coming more frequently over the next couple of months, starting at once a week, then once every 2 to 3 days, up to every day by Christmas break. I don't say anything to my family at that point, although I really should have. What started out as a decent beginning of college turned into not showing up for any classes, tests, nothing. Grades reflect, and I'm too busy answering for a 0.67 GPA to talk about some dumb prank that would likely be dismissed as a pathetic attempt at grades explanation. An eventful break, and back to school determined to become a new man I go. I have got to get my shit together with these shit grades, so I tell Bill I'm going to have to chill out and focus on school. That didn't last. First night back, I get my first spring semester call from the creepy guy. "How is your family in Cyprus?" Which is my hometown suburb. Okay, now this is bullshit. What kind of douche lords am I hanging out with that even have the discipline to drag out a prank this long? I get the answer to that question a few days later, and the answer is none of them. Calls become threatening and downright dark. "I'm very interested, Gary, in being close to you." Yeah, with kind of the weird sentence structure like that. I have tools I can bring. It is going to be all over soon. One day, I bring Brill and all my other buddies up to hear the messages, as I never deleted a single one. I guess when things happen over long periods of time, you don't really feel the cumulative impact until laying out the complete package of evidence. The guys are in shock, I guess. I should mention that some of these calls got really specific in making sure to note specific details about my parents' address as well as the violence they were planning to do to me. Cut open your esophagus. Gary, with a butter knife and all sorts of other crap that is sort of blurred together through the hundreds upon hundreds of calls I've received over the school year. A chick friend of mine that I'd recently got in contact with, who I liked a lot during high school, called Layla, reconnected with me thanks to good old AIM, and talked from time to time over the phone. The creepy stalker had mentioned a couple of times your friend and made threats about this unspecified person from time to time. But your friend turned into your friend Layla. Layla and I are the only two people ever named in these calls. But it did get me wondering if this was a new lead to the source. Layla, however, is clueless when I call her about it. Awesome. I know that background was a lot to digest, but you'll understand why I had to explain the situation when you learn the rest of the story. So one night we're all partying and drinking at some hotel. And of course, that straight A student crap went out of the window as the events progressed. A different buddy, Carl, had a nice big truck we'd all go everywhere in. But he'd passed out drunk at the hotel after pounding an entire bottle of God knows what. I'm not really drinking tonight and wanted to get back to my own bed, so I snatched Carl's keys and drive back down to campus, thinking I'll drive back in the morning to get everyone. This was one of the few times I'd ever driven that year, so I wasn't tip-top on my directions. I make an early turn and am somehow down a road I've never seen. I realize this pretty quickly, but I figure out I've got the general direction of campus pegged, so I can just continue the wrong road until hitting a familiar highway that I knew I'd eventually have to hit as it's close to campus. I'm finding myself in open fields, still a paved road, and everything but aside from the road there was absolutely nothing, and it was completely black. Around 3 a.m. there's this really strange four-way stop which I come across. Strange because I'm probably the 4th person in a year to drive on it. Anyway, I trudge along, eventually getting to the familiar highway, and I'm home free. A few days later, the weird creep interrupts his usual depraved threatenings to mention that specific four-way, the day and the time that I was on it, which, like I said, was around 3 a.m., and I can guarantee to you that there wasn't a soul in sight. So yeah, I now realize this creeper is obviously tracking my movements somehow. I also want to point out that after this I joined the military. I worked in the intelligence community and worked special operations and tracked bad guys all around the world. To this day I still can't quite figure out how this dude knew I was in the middle of those fields on that day in the middle of the night. I never mentioned it to anyone. Around March, this apparent rendezvous became the creeper's focal point, as he'd start making sure to let me know the day was close. The calls were coming in no fewer than 15 times every single day. Seriously. The ringer was now off out of courtesy to Cade, and I turned down the volume of the answering machine as his phone call was recorded. But I finally get the message I'd been waiting for. Keep in mind, I've now been somewhat infamous at the university because of the stalker. People were constantly knocking on my door wanting to hear the messages. Friends of everyone I knew would come around and would talk about it at parties. For a split second it was cool, because I'm pretty sure I ended up getting a few dates indirectly from introductions conceived through the interest of the guy with the stalker. Don't judge me. Moving right along, the day, time, location are all set. We will meet in front of Coleman Hall at midnight, Wednesday 27th April, and we will take our friendship to the next level. I know what you're thinking, and yeah, throughout the year I had considered the possibility that I was dealing with a girl. Hell hath no wrath like a woman scorned, and I was definitely the kind of dude that would leave young girls in their wake, and I attracted clinginess and anger, but I started to rule out females for various reasons. I can build profiles with a very high ratio of accuracy. This creep just didn't fit the profile to me. It didn't even feel like a peer. I was convinced I was dealing with a mid-30s white male computer nerd that I'd come into contact with at some point in my life. It really didn't matter because what I ended up finding out on that day, which by the way was Layla's birthday, is that I was wrong. Of course, everyone wants this to be the juicy part of the story, and there's a pretty ridiculous amount of testosterone floating around the dorm on game day. This was a real-life creepster and a legit horror story unfolding before their very eyes, and groupthink will subvert caution if properly motivated. These guys are ready to defend me with their lives. Just ask them. So while these monkeys are getting all hopped up on Mountain Dew, I stay home that afternoon wondering what the hell I was going to do at midnight. Of course I was going to go, but dude, yeah, I've always been an athlete. In good shape, and have done wrestling, football, baseball, the works. I'm still a 19-year-old male with good parents, and grew up in a good neighborhood, and I think I can definitely hold my own in a street fight, but this, whatever this is, didn't feel like a street fight or any other kind of fight that I'd been in. This is a disturbed, violent, angry, possibly grown-ass psychopath that has decided to dedicate almost a full year now of his life to targeting and terrorizing me. So yeah, I'm pretty freaking nervous. My home team crowd steadily built up throughout the afternoon and evening, with probably close to 70 or 80 guys grouped up at our dorm's common area smoking cigarettes and talking about beating the living shit and messing up anyone else who was gonna pop up, and all the generic cliche stuff you say when you're pretty high on testosterone. So my amazing entourage is ready, but once party hour approaches, most of them splinter off and bail. They were more inclined to beer pong and sorority girls, which is understandable, but I am left with 15 to 20 core members in my platoon. I had decided earlier that I was not going to allow these knuckleheads to shadow me, but I could definitely use them in case of emergency. I didn't want to risk him spooking out of the meeting. So I let them know that they will need to stay inside the doors of the common area as I walked out to the meeting spot. Common Hall was adjacent to our connected girls' dorm and about 300 paces outside the door to get to Common. So the witching hour came, and I leave the crew behind to begin the longest couple hundred or so paces of my life. My boys can see me through the glass door, but wouldn't really be able to see much once I get to Common Hall. About 100 paces out from my spot. That's when I noticed two things at the same time. One, some kind of small, quick movement in front of the patio walkway that goes all the way around the building. And two, the movement I was in a spot along the walkway where the only normal uber bright bulb is out. I'm not exactly sure how I was able to see him, but I suddenly realized that someone is crouched behind some bushes outside the patio perimeter against one of those pillar buildings in dark clothes and a hoodie. He is a few feet from the path where I am supposed to meet him. I'm positioned to where I really should not have been able to see him, given the pillar blocking any shadows, which I later found was smashed. Blocking any shadows and the smashed light. In fact, I could have easily walked all the way to the door without even noticing that he'd have been there. I sort of jump mid-step as this happens, and I see him rise up a little, thinking I may have seen him. I see him raise up and take a few steps towards me, and fight or flight kicks in. I've learned that if I think I can deal with the situation most of the time, I'll go with fight. When it comes to something terrifying, I'll go with flight. But in the very rare, and certainly this occasion of shit your pants terrifying, I think it's scarier to run away with having your back to whatever the thing is than just dealing with it. So I fight. And before I realize what I'm doing, I'm in a dead sprint towards this creeper who I'm guessing sees what I can't, which is my platoon bursting through the glass door in hot pursuit. The creeper nopes out of there, running on the patio alongside Coleman Hall towards the parking lot. I can tell this isn't the mid-30s computer nerd that I predicted. The creeper is above average height and above average build and built athletically. That's all I could tell really. I'm not even sure he was white because he looked a little tanned, maybe Spanish, maybe Middle Eastern. I'm not really sure. I am booking it as he turns right on a dime at the edge of the building. I realize I'm moving fast enough to catch him, but everyone else is really far behind. So I realize I'm moving so fast I won't be protected as I turn a hard right at the corner of the building. If he stops there, I'm toast. As I turn the corner, I see a van sitting alone in the parking lot in front of me. It's running and brake lights flicker on and off. It begins inching forward towards the exit. Homeless is of course heading for the van, which for some reason sent this whole new level of fear into me. This is it. It is really happening, and I'm going to get bloody murdered. But I can't stop. Something keeps pushing me forwards. I guess I've come this far. Dealt with this crazy bullshit for almost a year now. Completely unable to do anything other than try and ignore it. I'm not exactly going places academically at this point, and my life doesn't quite have all that much purpose to it yet either. If I'm going to get schwacked, I will at least know, and this crap will be over. Plus I still have a chance to catch this madman before he gets away. If I could just get close enough to dive tackle him, I would be able to deal with it on my own. But the driver I'm not too sure about. And it's at that moment I realize there's a third one of those miserable toads that was manning the sliding door. Great. I don't care how badass you think you are when you're a 19-year-old jock high on testosterone. Your chances of taking down 3 grown-ass men that are probably violent criminals and prepared to victimize you are not going to happen, buddy. My turn is wide and slow due to being in a full-on sprint, and I lose ground. I'm probably 20 yards away from the lot when he does a flying leap into the side of the van. There couldn't have been any rows of seats for a leap like that. The creepster number 3 slams the sliding door shut as the van peels out the parking lot. Bangs a right and he's gone in an instant. There's relief of not being kidnapped, bound, and gagged in that van with 3 psychos who will likely have some pretty horrific plans for me. The dread is fueling inside me because I know it's still not over. I was speechless, and so was my platoon as they catch up a minute after. A few of them caught up fast enough to witness the parking lot scene, but no one was talking. The testosterone had now been replaced with genuine earnest and concern. They all just stood there with me, catching their breath and making sure that I was all right. One guy asks if anyone got a plate number. We didn't. There wasn't enough light. We finally started walking back, and I'm reliving the scene as we retrace our steps. As we get closer to the original meeting spot, I see something that scares me more than anything else in the entire equation up to this point. On the opposite side of the pillar where Creepy McCree person was crouching, there was a video camera sitting on a stand pointed right at the spot I would have been standing at when I should have not been able to see him. It was still recording. The contents of the tape didn't have anything useful, just more creepiness. The recording began in the bush on the stand next to the pillar a few minutes before a meeting time. The first couple of minutes he was panning left and right slowly across the ground floor of the dorm, getting a more distant view of the building entrance that I would have taken and a closer view of anyone approaching the mess hall. People frequently ask me, what do you think that was all about? After some serious and genuine thought, I came to a very unnerving conclusion. Well, 2. The first is that it could have just been guys who wanted to play some kind of sick, insidious prank. Or that they really genuinely wanted to hurt me for whatever reason. Maybe I had done something to them years ago, like in high school, and they held an incredibly serious grudge. Which is weird because I don't really recall doing many bad things in high school. I was generally an okay kid, so that one is kind of hit and miss. But you never know. Some small words, some street talk can offend the most sensitive of souls. And if they're crazy, who knows what they can do? My more frightening conclusion, considering the recording, considering the preparation, considering the tracking, I honestly thought that they were planning to do some kind of snuff film. That is legitimately what I believed. The guy wanted to record everything that happened before with the calls and the tracking. He wanted to record the build-up. Then I approached completely unaware of him being there. And then they either threatened me or knocked me out. Get me in that van and the fun really begins. You know, I thought that shit was just deep web stuff and it was all a load of horse shit. But my God, I genuinely now think that I was wrong. Story 21. Back when I was in high school, my brother and 2 cousins ventured out on a long hike through miles of empty forest wilderness behind our house. We had explored the woods plenty of times as kids. But this time we wanted to go deeper than we had ever gone before. With food, flashlights, and knapsacks and everything. Fully aware that we would probably be gone for several hours and possibly might have to end up stopping and camping for a night. I did my best to mark a route for us using a map and compass. It was stupid. 4 kids under the age of 17 thinking that we could safely travel that deep into the sticks without anything happening. But we were young and confident. And none of our parents tried to talk us out of it. I was the oldest and the largest. I carried the compass and most of the supplies, including the tents and water. My brother Joe carried the first aid kit and flashlights, while my cousins, Lily and Tom, split the food between them, and Lily carried the flare gun. We only had 1 shot to use, and assumed that would be enough. We walked the majority of the day without incident. And after a few hours we spotted in the distance a wooden structure sticking up out of a tree line. Uncertain of what it was, we made for it, deciding that that was where we should set up camp. The sun was just starting to set by the time we reached it. And it turned out to be a very old overlook tower, probably for spotting forest fires. We estimated that it was probably 60 or 70 feet high, but it would be perilous to climb. The staircase was a single winding path that wound up the perimeter of the tower, without any support beams. We dropped our bags at the base of the stairs, and debated on how high we should climb. Lily and I wanted to make for the top, but Joe and Tom didn't trust the stairs, worried that they could give way beneath us. Lily and I made our way up slowly, placing one careful foot in front of the other. When I was about halfway up, a rotted plank broke from beneath me, and my whole leg sank down through the wet wood. I came down at an odd angle and bent my right leg. I cried out and pulled my left leg through the hole as I sank down to sit carefully on the stairs. Tom and Joe heard my cry and started up the stairs. And Lily in turn started back down, which probably was the smartest thing to do. But we were all panicking kids. When the others got to me, I immediately started insisting that I was okay, and that we all couldn't be up here this high on this weak staircase, and we should start heading back down. Joe was the first to reach the bottom when he stopped, pointed towards a nearby tree and yelled, "Hey you." We all looked. There was someone standing by a tree just looking at us. We couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but the figure was extremely lanky with a ridiculous amount of gray hair and wearing an ancient jacket and jumpsuit. It looked like they had been just peeled off from the bottom of a dumpster. The four of us froze, and we all just stared. None of us knew what to say as the figure just stared at us. Then the stranger came towards the stairs. We freaked out and all scampered as fast as we could. Right back up the stairs towards the platform. I stalked about 2/3 of the way up and looked back. The person was going through our bags at the base of the stairs. I then yelled, "Get the fuck out of there," while the others tried to open the trapdoor at the top of the stairs. The figure looked up at me and called out something that I couldn't understand. I'm not sure if it was because the others were making so much noise right above me, or because the stranger wasn't speaking English. It was a very high-pitched voice, so I assumed at that point it was a woman. I pulled out a small pocket knife and sat there waiting for her to follow us up. She didn't. She sat at the base of the stairs, ate our food and pocketed most of our things. When it became full dark out, she was still sitting there, and we were all unsure of what to do. We couldn't get up onto the platform, and we couldn't see enough to know if it was safe enough to climb down. I know what you might be thinking. You chicken shits, just go down and grab her. That very thought crossed my mind several times during the night, but without flashlights, and given the fact that I was injured, I didn't want to risk it. She could have had a weapon on her for all I knew. She most definitely had access to the flare gun. Not that it would have helped us much if we had it. With a platform above us, we couldn't fire it straight up to signal for help. By the time first light of dawn peeked through the trees, I was stiff, very hungry and sore. Joe, Tom, and Lily spent a sleepless night trying to remain quiet and not shift their weight very often. The figure down below was gone. We limped to the bottom of the stairs. We grabbed what possessions we had left, and Tom and Joe helped me hobble back home on one leg. It was the longest 14 hours of my life. From when I hurt my leg on the stairs to the moment I sank down in agony on my couch at home and took off my boots. To this day, I still have no idea who that woman was. Most likely some homeless weirdo hiding out in the forest where no one could bother her. We also didn't know why the trap door wouldn't open. Tom presented the idea that someone may have locked it from atop the platform. Not sure how that would work. As miserable as this experience was, we all made it back shaken and exhausted, and other than my hurt ankle, we were all unscathed. It didn't occur to me until much later that hurting my leg may have saved us all. What if we had camped on the ground that night, and while we were all asleep, the strange woman had crept into our camp? I think it could have been a whole lot worse. Story 22. This is one of those experiences that sticks with you regardless of how much time passes. The kind that you make sure you tell your friends and family when reminiscing about scary experiences. This took place during my high school days back in 2008. Starting high school wasn't exactly the best time in my life. I despised the politics of the high school macrocosm, and I didn't get along with most of the students or the teachers. I was kind of an outcast. I decided that I was through with school because I saw it as nothing but a toxic environment and a waste of my time. This naturally didn't go over well with my parents. My mother is a school teacher, so I would have to hear those lectures about how education is the foundation for the rest of your life. Blah, blah, blah. Looking back from where I am now, I can agree. But I was an impulsive teenager with a lack of common sense. After about a year, I enrolled in an alternate school called Mormicans, which was a place of sanctuary for pregnant teenagers and dropout rejects like myself. They offered me the opportunity to obtain a high school diploma and a special program that would allow me to graduate a year earlier than what I was supposed to. I was originally class of 2011, but with this program I was now officially class of 2010. She had a year off my sentence. Sign me up. I went through the process of being enrolled, and before I knew it I was hopping on the bus for my first day of my sophomore-junior year. I couldn't help but bask in the admiration of flunking my freshman year, and yet was still one step ahead of my former classmates. When I arrived, it was basically back to square one for me. I was surrounded by young women in various stages of pregnancy and young men with time in juvenile hall under their belts. Needless to say, I didn't exactly fit in with the crowd. So I sat alone in the cafeteria during breakfast and stared off into space, speaking to no one. Until this dude I recognized walked through the lunchroom doors. His name was George, and he was one of the very few people I actually talked to at my previous high school. We weren't exactly close friends or anything, but he was the only person I knew at Mormicans. It turns out we were pretty much in the same boat. I waved him over and we made small talk and reconnected. Later that day my sister offered to pick me up from school, so after classes were over I went outside to the parking lot to wait for her. George had someone picking him up as well, so we got to talking again. "How was your day, man?" "It sucked." "I hear you, man. People are so fucking stupid. I wish I could just kill them all." Yeah, sure. I'm serious. I would totally bring a gun to mow them all down. I fucking hate people. Yeah, sure. Hey, there's my sister. I'll catch you later. George went silent and gave me a blank stare as I quickly made my way to the car. Now you're probably wondering why the conversation didn't raise any red flags, but I had about a million things on my mind. So I brushed off the morbid conversation as just bitter adolescent talk. The next day the class schedule alternated, and George and I ended up having the same art class. On a side note, the art teacher and I were cool because she would let me draw pictures of skulls and zombies and stuff instead of doing the lame-ass work she assigned. Anyway, I was sitting at a table with George and two other guys. The two dudes were talking to each other, and I was drawing this sweet picture of Iron Maiden's The Trooper. George suddenly got up and walked over to the classroom door and ripped down a map of the school that was taped to the wall next to the door. He brought it back to the table and proceeded to mark on it with a red pen. One of the other guys asked him what he was doing. "You'll see. Everyone will." Even then, I didn't think too much of it, even though I remembered the conversation we had at the parking lot. You have to understand that George seemed to get off on the uncomfortable attention he got being vague and creepy, and this school was meant to be a place for outcasts. I figured he was just imagining some fucked up fantasy or something. A couple of days after that, I was walking to art class again, but just before I entered, the door opened and a police officer left the room escorting George away, followed by the principal. I froze in genuine shock and dread, and all I could think was, oh shit. George was staring right at me with cold eyes as he passed, and I had to look away. Turns out, I wasn't the only person he hinted to about his twisted aspirations. The school was full of young parents, after all, and apparently they took his behavior as more of a threat than I did, and in retrospect, I don't blame them. They found some stuff on his MySpace page that alluded to some sort of plot to shoot up the school. Here in Florida, threats like that are taken very seriously, even if it is just some fucked up teenager spouting some bullshit because he hates his life. It turns out the police found more than 28 firearms at his home. Although, to be fair, they were all registered to George's grandfather and were kept in a locked gun cabinet. Though I suppose gaining access to the guns wouldn't have been too difficult for someone like him. Thankfully, George was taken away and nothing ever came of his plans. Sadly, Mormigans was shut down a few years ago. Aside from this incident, I ended up having some pretty good times there. I got my act together and ended up graduating in the class of 2010. I can't say for sure if George would have gone through with it, but I'll never forget the cold certainty behind what he said that day in art class. You'll see. Everyone will. I had a friend. Story 23. Who once lived on 40 acres of heavy forest in marshland. Once the warmer weather began, we would put together a group of 6 people and go paintballing, playing on teams of 3. In my mind, there is absolutely no better place to paintball because the terrain varied from rocky to wetlands, from steep to smooth, depending on the area we chose to use. It was entirely private property, so there was no chance of running into anyone else or being reported for trespassing. And since the area was so expansive, we would often find ourselves playing somewhere new on the property that we had never been to before. We would normally use quads or dirt bikes to travel to different sections of the property, and on the afternoon that this happened, we drove until the tanks were half empty and then traversed another quarter-mile on foot before we drew lots for teams and scattered into the woods. The theme of that battle was Marvel vs. DC, so each of us had assigned ourselves a codename of a comic book villain from whatever side we were on. I found a small bluff to use as an overwatch point, and picked out a spot to hide for a few minutes while I adjusted my helmet and boots. Once I stopped shifting my weight around, I knelt down for a few moments, and then I heard the sound of uncontrolled sobbing coming from nearby behind me to the south. For a moment, I considered that it could be one of my friends, but after I removed my helmet, I listened more closely. I realized the voice was much too deep. It sounded like a fully grown adult crying like a drunk at a funeral. I debated whether to ignore it, but my curiosity got the better of me. Setting aside the fact that this was private property, and no one but us should have been this deep into the woods, the man sounded like he might have needed some help. About halfway to the source of the noise, I encountered one of my teammates, who had also heard the sobbing, and decided to investigate. The two of us moved forward together, with our paintball guns up, knowing full well that if we were walking into actual danger, they wouldn't be very useful at all. After another moment, we discovered a crumbling 2-story brick house that looked to us as though it had been standing there since the Civil War. The sobbing and yelling was coming from one of the upstairs windows, though by this time it had died down considerably. The friend who lived on the property wasn't there with us, otherwise we would have just had him deal with it. What we should have done was go back for help, but again we were curious and concerned that this sobbing man may have been in some kind of trouble. We carefully entered through the busted front door, not making a sound to announce ourselves. All the windows were missing, so the inside had a damp outdoors feel to it. There was dirt, leaves, and rusty beer cans all over the floor, and despite it being so drafty, the place reeked of pot and sweat, and someone had spray painted the words, "Stay here," on one of the inner walls. Once we got to the base of the stairs, I decided the tension had gone on long enough, and I called out, "Hey, are you all right up there?" It was like I had awoken a grizzly bear. Someone upstairs roared with insane fury, and came charging towards the top of the stairs with purpose. Dust fell from the ceiling, as the stranger upstairs came sprinting forward to attack. We turned and launched ourselves back out the front door, and back out into the trees, as the screams of a haggard man warned us to back off. We took position in the trees in case the guy decided to follow us. That way we could open fire at him with paintballs, and at least slow him down, But once he got to the front door, he paused, squinting stupidly at the daylight for a moment, before heading back inside. We each only caught a glimpse of him. Imagine the sweatiest, scraggliest beard attached to an old scarecrow with about 14 layers of solid coats on. We marked our position as best we could, and headed back. When we finally got back to our friends, they reported that they had run into two very drunk and furious homeless-looking guys, who had charged at them for a few yards before they were forced to defend themselves by firing off several paintball rounds and driving their attackers away. We booked it back to the bikes, drove back to our friend's house, and called the police. A patrol car showed up there in about 20 minutes, but no one headed out into the woods for close to an hour, until there were enough men gathered to head out and investigate, and have air support from a helicopter. It wasn't until after dark that we discovered at least 4 homeless men had been living in that old brick house, and one of them had died in the night, likely from an overdose of some kind. 2 of them had wandered off to go look for a car to carry him away and bury him. The third had stayed with him and sobbed uncontrollably over the death of his friend. Apparently the place was well known in the homeless community as somewhere that you could go to disappear for a while. Even though there were several knives found in the house, none of the men had any weapons on their person when they were found and arrested for trespassing. My friend's parents have since scheduled the small house to be demolished, and were completely unaware it had been there to begin with. That's my story, perhaps not the scariest encounter ever, but it definitely put life into perspective for us. You were just dumb kids out having fun without a care in the world, and unknowingly stumbled across a safe haven for men whose lives were hopeless and fueled by drugs. Had we not been so careful, some of us, or all of us, may have never made it back to the house alive, and who knows how long it would have taken before our bodies were discovered. Thank you for listening, and I wish you good health. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us. Thank you very much.